Hello and welcome everyone to the Solo Multimedia Podcast where I give you my unfiltered take straight off the cuff. And today I'm gonna be going back in the year and listening to some old records that I missed as we're coming up to the end of the year, and album of the year lists are all sort of, starting to get put together and whatnot. Over this year there's been a bunch of different records that I feel as though I probably would enjoy, but just didn't get a chance to listen to them. So I think as we move towards the end of the year, throughout December, I'm just going to be doing a lot of records that, that have come out over the course of the year that I didn't get a chance to listen to first time around. And the first one today is one that I definitely should have listened to up until this point. The Smile. I can't remember the name of the album now. It's on my notes here. A Light for Attracting Attention. There you go. So for those who don't know, The Smile are a rock band, I guess you could say, like an art rock kind of like, just like an art rock experimental rock band that are essentially born of the ashes of Radiohead. I know Radiohead haven't like officially disbanded or anything, but they haven't done anything in a while. It seems like they're probably done at least for a bit. So I can't remember the exact members this band has, but it's got Thom Yorke, who's the vocalist and kind of a very iconic member in Radiohead. And I know it has at least one other member, maybe two. But essentially, for me personally, I've always been I've never been the biggest fan of Radiohead. But around the time that A Moon-Shaped Pool came out, they kind of finally clicked for me. So I'm still definitely very, very, very late to the party when it comes to them. But I can appreciate what they did from an artistic perspective. I can respect the fact they're pretty peerless in what they did. They're like very, very unique. And it's kind of crazy they're as successful as they were, being so idiosyncratic, also massive innovators when it comes to tying in different types of arrangements for your rock music and using like electronics in it and whatnot. Like there's just a ton of like praise you could throw at Radiohead for sure. But essentially what we have here is, in my opinion, largely, I guess you could say, another Radiohead album, really. A lot of the elements, if you're a big Radiohead fan, a lot of the elements from Radiohead are definitely very much still here in The Smile. But I feel like what they've essentially done is, over the course of Radiohead's discography, they've made so many different, like so many records in different styles, all of which that are like incredibly detailed with kind of their own unique flavors, like very, very, very kind of like sophisticated songwriting and all that kind of stuff, right? So this feels like essentially they've decided to not really change the sound, but just almost take it back to basics. Like across this record, you're essentially getting relatively simple melodies and kind of like chord driving features, and then just loads of like jammed out kind of details tied into the mix. Lots of like very warm, fuzzy guitar playing and bass playing, very like tight, punchy, repetitive grooves. So it feels like in a way they've kind of gone back to basics without doing anything largely different. Honestly, like straight up, this record is very well produced. There's really good interplay between the musicians, and it's very clear that it's been made by a bunch of very experienced musicians, even if it isn't quite as like detailed or intricate as you might get or you might be used to from Radiohead. But on the other hand, one thing that you do get on this record in absolute spades, maybe even more so than most of the previous discography from the members, is you get a lot of lush soundscapes and really delicately crafted atmospheres that are just very dreamy in nature, thanks to Thom's completely one-of-a-kind vocals. It's definitely, like I said, a lot more stripped back than Radiohead was, so it's very possible they just kind of wanted to return to basics a little bit. Just to give my overall thoughts, I thought this record was like very, very solid. Definitely in the camp of like good, maybe even great. My biggest criticism, I'll just throw out right off the bat, is the fact that I feel like it's just a little too long. It pulls from the same bag of tricks a little bit too much, and it definitely could have been tighter. It doesn't feel like it adds anything new to what the members are doing, which, not too surprising considering what it is. But even still, it definitely feels like it could have had maybe slightly more of a personality of its own. But that's kind of like my overall thoughts, and I can get into each of the tracks, because like one thing that's interesting, even though most of these tracks have a very similar vibe and make a very cohesive atmosphere, I actually do think there is oh sorry, pardon me. I actually think that there is a decent amount of variation within the individual tracks and how they achieve that. So, for example, the very opening track, The Same, has these kind of like throbbing keys that slowly build with other instrumentation coming into the mix before Thom's absolutely iconic vocals gently come in and sit atop it. It's a very lush, soft opening that's more of a tone setter than a song. I don't think there's really much else on the rest of the album that sounds like this, with the exception of maybe one track right near the end. But it's like a pretty unique track for what they've done across this record. It's a solid intro. I like the progression, I like the details, I like the way it has a pretty dense climax while maintaining its very calm demeanour, but it is kind of odd this one's like so electronic when a focus of a lot of this record is very much around the kind of like, you know, just tight little drum grooves and like very nice bass playing, like these delicately played guitar lines, stuff like that. The next track, The Opposite, goes in a very different direction from the opening song and also is fairly unique again amongst the track listing. It has this very like crisp, punchy drum groove complemented with like a slightly off-kilter, almost like math rock inspired guitar riff. I really love the like soured guitar lick around 110. This song is just overall a pretty simple song, but they managed to keep it interesting with solid interplay between instruments in a way that only very experienced musicians can typically. There's nice little variations on the riffs, and the drums do a fantastic job of holding it all together, rooting the song in a tight groove. The next track is yet another change in pace. You'll Never Work in Television Again. This is essentially, like, in my opinion, Radiohead's take on something like Idols or Ice Age, like that kind of like very fuzzy, like post-punk, slightly aggressive vibe. It has these like it's got loads of like punch in the drums. It's very much like fall to the floor beat played on the toms, and then like fuzzy, distorted guitars. Overall, I like the general vibe, but I do feel like this one's perhaps a little bit less memorable than a lot of the tracks across this record. But fortunately, that's not really an issue beyond this point, because Panavision is a song in which the piano very much takes centre stage. It opens with a very strange melody, and Thom's highest register vocals floating above them. But once the whole band kicks in, it settles into a more dreamy tone, with each element being rather delicate, but essentially coming together really well. I especially love the bass work on here. The whole track just makes me feel like I'm in a slightly uncanny dream state, feeling that definitely resolves in something more comforting thanks to some gorgeous strings towards the back end. Super memorable track. Essentially, it's definitely a highlight amongst the track listing. It's in my opinion the kind of like the gold standard or watermark that I think a standard song on this record should be held to, essentially. So great track, big fan of Panavision. The next song, The Smoke, falls roughly into the same camp as The Opposite, in that it's a slightly punchier track with a really nice riff, or in this case a bass groove, that's very much the main feature of the track and kind of the skeleton that everything is built around. The way the track brings in other elements is incredibly satisfying, and it feels very organically jammed out because it all just adds complementary parts to the core groove. While the track is repetitive, it has enough one-off ideas and deviations to keep its trancey hold on my attention. It's just another like really good groovy track that sticks out in my mind. Speech Bubbles is an incredibly delicate, lush song, but this one is sort of closer to a ballad than some of the others, with vocals very much taking the limelight and the backdrop just being a pretty simple guitar-driven soundscape, aided by ambient synth sounds and very gentle percussion. The drums do kick in towards the end, but it very much feels like an extension of the track rather than a switch or anything like that. Oh, yeah, okay, sorry, I was trying to read the sentence that I've written down as a note, and it's a bit weirdly written, but the song title is called, the next track, Thin Thing, so that's the next track's name, Thin Thing. It very much reminds me of something that Radiohead would have written on, like, OK Computer. It has a slightly, a very prominent, slightly angular guitar riff, and the rest of the elements falling into place around that, but it does have some details that I really love. The chorus drum complementing the rhythm of the guitars on the ride cymbal hits just sounds super great, and it's played so tight despite having this very like fuzzy organic production, so I'm a big fan of that. It sounds great. And also around the midpoint you get these weird like sound effects on Thom Yorke's vocals that make them sound like they loop into each other and then pitch higher. I'm not particularly familiar with whatever it is, but it sounds really cool, and it's a nice little detail to have in the mix. Overall, I feel like it's a decent track, but it did feel a touch underbaked to me. It definitely felt like, especially as the track goes to the close, it sort of runs out of ideas a little bit. But, you know, no huge criticism there. It still maintains the kind of dreamy, cohesive tone of the whole record while being its own thing to some extent. Open the Floodgates is another Lush ballad, but this time it has a very futuristic synth melody as the main element. It almost sounds like something you'd hear a like computer make in Star Trek, which is just really bizarre. But the song has this like very haunting atmosphere that reminds me quite a lot of the material from Moon-Shaped Pool. It's a solid rendition with a good amount of piano aiding Thom's vocals, and despite being one of the long tracks, I felt like it could have actually gone on for a bit longer. I really felt like it was quite a captivating atmosphere they'd crafted on this one specifically. So it's a bit unfortunate, but still a decent track nonetheless. Free in the Knowledge is probably the first time on the album that the song is just almost entirely driven by acoustic guitar delivered in a very almost like standard folky way. It's probably the most stripped back setup on the album, with very few other elements in the first half. But on the back end, a bunch of strings like swell up into the mix, and they have these like droning synths in the background that really like hold everything together. Eventually, a drum groove brings in a very warm bass riff, and I really love the progression of the song. While it isn't anything super unique, it is. Oh, sorry, pardon me. Well, it isn't anything super unique. It is, as you would expect with musicians, this experience like very masterfully put together and just structured very well. Everything lasts for as long as it needs to be. It's just another solid track. So I would say after this point is around the point where I started to get just a little bit of the feeling like the songs were starting to repeat themselves a touch. So, like I said, Free in the Knowledge was a song I really enjoyed. But it does, again, maintain that kind of like mid-paced, like lush, jammed out, like dreamy atmosphere. And the next song, A Hairdryer, is 100% consisting of the same elements we've heard like up until this point, kind of all smushed together a little bit. So it's another song that has a core driving drum groove with delicate and detailed instrumentations placed over the top, slowly building as it like goes into this kind of feeling that you are a fly on a wall of this like jam session that's happening just organically. But again, at this point, I do feel like this song very much pulls from the same bag of tricks as everything else, so it does feel a little bit like it doesn't really stick out. It doesn't have like a super unique personality of its own or bring anything particularly new to the table, which is kind of unfortunate actually, because I didn't think it was a bad track by any stretch. It still has all of the positives that I've mentioned up to this point. It's very well put together, clearly played by experienced musicians. It's tight, it feels organic, it's got this dreamy atmosphere that's well crafted, but it just, again, it's like a little bit too much of, like second verse, same as the first, essentially. The next track, though, Waving a White Flag, immediately caught my attention with this synth progression that opens with a pretty strange sound effect that I can't properly describe, and these strings that are weaved into the intro that just help draw the listener in. And once Thom's vocals come in, the song is actually like incredibly lush, but still quite strange and standoffish. Also like like lush in a very almost alien way. That is something I feel like only Thom can really pull off. It's got a very unique vibe, but it works super well. The song eventually does build into something with drums and effects that eventually allow a synth melody that sounds like something you would hear in Stranger Things to really steal the show over this kind of like very tight groovy drum pattern. But eventually it just sort of peters out on guitar and vocals. This was definitely like a song that I was welcome to hear towards the end of the track. Towards the end of the album. But that's even more true, actually, of the next track, We Don't Know What Tomorrow Brings. So this is probably only the second track on the album that really hits in a more punchy, like post-punky kind of way. And with most of the album being so atmospheric and lush, it's very welcome towards the end. This track actually probably has the most urgency without losing its delicacy. That makes a lot of this record really, really good. It's just ultra groovy, like jammed out, spacey art punk rager with a really like earwormy hook, despite how kind of reverby and soft sung it is. I love a lot of the added textures the band didn't play, and the length for a tune like this is perfect. It's just like a very, very solid, almost final track, and in my opinion probably should have been the final track, because the actual final track here, which is called Skirting on the Surface, at least I think that's what it's called, it's kind of spelled weirdly, is honestly just another delicately played atmospheric guitar-led track with a middling pace, and it's got a few neat details like throughout the mix for sure. So at the start there's these background vocals that sound really nice, and it progresses in a satisfying way, but at this point it's just unfortunate because there's nothing special enough in this track to really not only stand out from the rest of the track listing, but also to justify its longer length. This track's one of the only songs that breaches 5 minutes. I think it's the longest. It might not be though. And, as the record has already felt like a little bit dragged, it's just unfortunate because, it's not a bad closer by any stretch. It just feels a little redundant in the track listing here. So yeah, that's kind of like my overall thoughts on the end. But yeah, overall, I think the record was definitely good. It was a very pleasant listen. I could see myself returning to this for sure. There's so many elements of it are just like really great and easy to appreciate if if you've listened to anything Radiohead have done, or if you're not familiar with them at all, this would actually probably serve as a really good entry point, to be honest, because it's, again, quite stripped back, but has all the experience that they've gained up until this point to keep everything, like very atmospheric and, yeah, just well put together. So yeah, I really enjoyed this as a promising first album for a band that hopefully will get more of an identity moving forwards. But yeah, I don't think there's anything more to say. It's just a solid listen that I'm glad I got around to eventually doing, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm going to be covering for the next bunch, but hey, I'm sure I'll dig in the archives and find something. But yeah, cheers for listening, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this. Stay safe and peace out, alright?